The first time I walked into the chamber of the Galactic Council, an alien guard pressed a blue tag into my hand and pointed me toward a frosted glass partition at the far end of the hall. The partition was not subtle. It was not meant to be. It was a statement dressed up as architecture, a wall that said, "You may watch, but you do not belong here." I clipped the tag to my collar and walked to my seat behind it. I sat down. I opened my datapad. And I told myself that this was fine. That patience was a strategy. That every great thing required a long wait. I told myself a lot of things in those early days. I had to. My name is Yara Osei. I was 34 years old when Earth sent me to Vethsora Prime as its first observer delegate to the Galactic Council. My government gave me the title like it was an honor. What it actually was, I understood on my very first day, a polite way of keeping us outside the room while pretending to let us in. The chamber itself was extraordinary. I will give them that. It was built inside a carved mountain, and the ceiling was so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top. Hundreds of species sent delegates here. The Vethani, who ran the council, moved through the hall in long robes that shifted color with their mood. The Dalhari sat in clusters, their forearms folded, their flat gray faces watching everything at once. The Sorrel kind hovered above their seats on quiet fields of electromagnetic force, never touching the floor. And in the very center of the chamber, beneath a chandelier of living bioluminescent coral, sat the council table. Long white. Carved from a single piece of mineral that had been cooling in deep space for 1 billion years before the Vethani found it. I sat behind a frosted partition and watched all of this through blurred glass. My government said I was not behind it. They called it a viewing screen. Diplomatic language is a wonderful thing. You can rename anything and, if you say it with enough confidence, people begin to believe the new name. But I knew what it was. And so did every alien in the chamber who glanced toward my corner and then looked away again. The first vote I witnessed was about trade tariffs on water ice transport in the Outer Ring systems. It did not affect Earth directly. I still filed an opinion, because my instructions said I was allowed to file opinions. The filing system accepted my document with a small green confirmation. I later learned that all observer filings were automatically routed to a secondary archive that no active delegate was required to read. I filed opinions for 6 months before I confirmed this. I found out by asking an administrative clerk, a young Dalhari woman named Res, who had been assigned to assist observer delegates. She told me with genuine kindness, as if she was doing me a favor by being honest. She said, "The archive is reviewed annually, Observer Osei. Sometimes quarterly, if there is a slow session." She paused. "I am sorry. I thought you knew." I thanked her and went back to my seat. I sat very still for a long time. That evening, I sent a message to Secretary General Paul Adair back on Earth. I told him about the archive. I told him that no one read our filings. I asked for guidance. His reply came 14 hours later, delayed by the relay distance. It said, "Continue filing. We must maintain the appearance of engagement. Trade negotiations with the Vethani are at a sensitive stage." Appearance of engagement. I read those 3 words 4 times. Then I saved the message, closed my datapad, and lay on the narrow cot in my assigned quarters, staring at a ceiling that hummed faintly with the ventilation system. The room smelled of mineral water and something faintly chemical, the cleaning agent the station used on its floors. Not unpleasant. Just foreign. Everything here was just foreign. I thought about my grandmother, Adwoa, who had walked from one village to another as a child during a drought because her family had no other choice. When I was small and I asked her what she did when things were hard, she said, "You keep your eyes open and your mouth careful, Yara. You learn everything. You give away nothing." She tapped the side of her head when she said it. "What you carry in here, no one can take." I was not sure what I was learning yet. But I kept my eyes open. In the months that followed, the council held 42 sessions. I attended all of them. I sat behind my frosted partition with my datapad and I watched. I learned the rhythms of the chamber, which delegate spoke first and why, which species aligned by instinct and which aligned by calculation. I learned that the Vethani, for all their elegance, were deeply afraid of disruption. They built consensus slowly and wrapped everything in ceremony, because ceremony made change feel like tradition. I learned that the Dalhari voted as a bloc on economic issues but fractured along geographic lines on anything touching their home system. I learned that the Sorrelkind were the most dangerous voices in the room, not because they were aggressive, but because they were patient in a way that no one else in that chamber was. Except, I started to think, us. Earth was the only species that had been probationary for more than 20 years. Most species achieved full membership within a decade. Probationary status came with strict conditions: no voting, no proposals, no ability to call a point of order or demand a review of a past resolution. We could submit opinions that went to a secondary archive. We could attend sessions from behind a frosted partition. And we were required, by the terms of our probationary agreement, to maintain what the Council called cooperative neutrality. Which meant that if the Council did something that harmed Earth's interests, we were not allowed to object publicly. We could file an opinion to the archive that no one read. Earth had agreed to these terms 60 years ago, before I was born, when we were still terrified and new to all of this and desperate to be part of something larger than ourselves. 60 years ago, full membership had seemed like something we would earn quickly, if we just stayed polite and followed the rules. We were still polite. We had filed 11,244 opinions. I counted. Res confirmed the number for me one afternoon when I asked, with the same gentle kindness she always showed. "You are the most active observer delegation in the Council's history," she said, as if this were a compliment. It was not a compliment. On the 319th day of my posting, the Council voted to reclassify 3 moons in the outer ring of the Kepler-62 system. These were moons where 12,000 human settlers had been living for 8 years, building hydroponic farms, extraction units, and a small but functioning community. The reclassification listed them as uninhabited resource zones, available for licensing to any registered Council member entity. 12,000 people. Uninhabited. I filed 14 objections that day. I typed them with my hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from something colder than fear. Something that I had not felt before in exactly this way. A kind of clarity. The archive accepted all 14 with small green confirmations. That night, I called Secretary General Adair directly. I did not write. I called. I waited through the relay delay, 7 minutes each way, and I told him clearly what had happened. 12,000 people. Classified as uninhabited. I said the words slowly. His response, when it came, was careful. He said the situation was being monitored. He said that Earth's legal team was reviewing the relevant treaty language. He said that we should not take any public action that might damage the ongoing trade negotiations. I sat with the line open for a long moment after he finished. Then I said, "Paul. They called 12,000 of our people uninhabited." The relay delay stretched between us. He said, "I know, Yara. I know. Stay the course." I closed the line. I went to bed. I did not sleep for a long time. But I kept my eyes open. And I kept filing. And I kept watching. And I told myself that patience was a strategy. I told myself that every morning. I needed to believe it. Because in that chamber, behind that frosted partition, with my data pad full of opinions that no one read, it was the only thing that kept me from standing up and saying something that would end everything before it had a chance to begin. I was 34 years old. I had no idea yet what was being built back home. I would find out. But not yet. Not yet. The vote on the Kth Accord happened on a Tuesday, which I mention only because Tuesday had always struck me as the most unremarkable day of the week, and I found a bitter sort of irony in the fact that it was the day the Galactic Council decided to starve us. I want to be precise about what the Kth Accord actually was, because the Council was very careful with its language when they passed it, and I refused to be equally careful. The official name was the Coordinated Biosynthetic Resource Management Framework. 12 words. They use 12 words because the more words you stack on top of a thing, the harder it becomes to see the thing underneath. What it was, underneath, was a trade sanction. A sweeping, deliberate, total blockade on the export of biosynthesizer components to any non-member world. And Earth, still probationary after 60 years, was very much a non-member world. Biosynthesizers were not a luxury. This is important. They were not something Earth used to make things more comfortable. By the time the Kth Accord passed, 31% of Earth's food supply depended on biosynthesizer technology, specifically on a class of protein assembly components that we had not yet learned to manufacture ourselves. We were close. Our engineers had been working on it for years. But close was not there, and the Galactic Council knew exactly how close we were and exactly how much time we would need. They timed it. I am certain of that now, though I could not prove it then. They timed the Accord for maximum impact. Ambassador Threlvan of the Vethani delivered the rationale. He was a tall, smooth-voiced being with iridescent skin that rippled through pale golds and greens as he spoke. In the many months I had spent watching him, I had come to understand that the gold meant confidence and the green meant something close to pleasure. He was very gold and very green as he addressed the chamber. He explained that the Accord was a matter of cultural hygiene. He said, and I am reconstructing this from my notes because I need you to understand that I am not exaggerating, that unregulated species posed a contamination risk to the stability of cooperative galactic culture. He said that Earth, specifically, had demonstrated emotional volatility patterns inconsistent with the measured discourse required of full participants in the Council's framework. Emotional volatility. He meant that we argued. He meant that we pushed back. He meant that in the 11,000 opinions we had filed over 60 years, some of them had used language that was direct and firm and not wrapped in the careful, layered, 32-word diplomatic softening that the Vethani preferred. He meant that we were human. And then, smoothly, with the gold still warm in his skin, he said that the Accord was not a punishment. It was a developmental pause, designed to encourage Earth to reflect and mature before seeking deeper integration with the Council's systems. The Chamber approved it. Not unanimously. The Dalhari delegation voted against it in 3 of its 4 geographic blocks, and I noted this, because the Dalhari were not known for sympathy toward probationary worlds. But the Sorrelkind abstained, and the Vethani called the vote before any extended debate could form, and the Kth Accord passed. I was behind my partition. I could not call a point of order. I could not demand a delay. I could not even speak. I watched Threlvan accept congratulations from 2 of his colleagues. The gold in his skin deepened. He glanced toward my partition once, briefly, the way you might glance at a piece of furniture you had decided to rearrange. I picked up my data pad. I opened a new filing. I began typing with the same steady hands that I had trained over years of deliberate, practiced calm. I filed an objection. I filed a request for review. I filed a formal notation that Earth contested the classification of its settlements as non-participant zones. I filed everything I was procedurally allowed to file. Then I closed the pad, stood up, nodded to Ress across the room, and walked back to my quarters. And there I did something I had never allowed myself to do in all the months of being behind that partition. I sat down on my cot, and I let myself feel it. All of it. Not the professional, measured disappointment of a diplomat. The real thing underneath. The anger. The helplessness. The specific, acid burn of watching something terrible happen and having every single avenue of response surgically removed. I let myself feel it for exactly 10 minutes. I had a timer on my pad. When the timer ended, I opened a new channel. Not to the archive. Not to Secretary General Adair's office. I opened a direct, encrypted line using a routing protocol that predated the Council's monitoring frameworks, one that Earth's communications team had maintained for exactly this kind of moment. Adair picked up in 30 seconds. Not 14 hours. 30 seconds. Which told me he had been waiting. They passed it, I said. I know. His voice was different from the voice I had heard through careful relay calls. This voice was stripped of the diplomatic softness. This was Paul Adair the man, not Paul Adair the Secretary General. We were watching the session. They called it a developmental pause. Yes. Paul. I stopped. I tried to find words that were precise enough. They just declared war. They wrapped it in 12 words and a speech about cultural hygiene, but they declared war. They looked at 31% of our food supply and they drew a line through it. There was a pause. Not a relay pause. A thinking pause. I know what it is, Yara. Then what are we doing? What is the response? Another pause. Then, the response has already been sent. I frowned. What do you mean? I didn't see any communication go out from our office. Not from your office, he said. We sent a communiqué through the primary diplomatic band. Single page. Stamped final notice. I pulled up the public diplomatic log on my pad. I found it. 1 page. Sent 2 minutes after the vote closed. I read it. It was short. It was extremely short. It said that Earth received the terms of the Keth Accord, that Earth contested its legality under 5 specific provisions of the original probationary agreement, and that Earth reserved all rights and options available to it under circumstances of imposed economic pressure. Reserved all rights and options. They won't read it, I said. You know that. Anything we send goes to the archive, Paul. No active delegate is required to. I know, he said. They won't read it. Then why? Because when this is over, he said, and it will be over, Yara, the record needs to show that we gave them every chance. The line was quiet for a moment. Outside my window, the lights of Vethsora Prime's orbital ring were a slow, steady ring of gold and white against the dark. Beautiful, in the way that powerful things were sometimes beautiful, not because of what they were, but because of how much they had taken to build. What happens now? I asked. Now, said Paul Adair, you go back into that chamber tomorrow morning. You sit behind your partition. You file your opinions. You smile at the clerk. You do everything exactly as you have been doing. And you wait, he said. Just a little longer. I did not like the answer. But I had been waiting for years, and I had gotten very good at it. How much longer? I asked. There was the smallest pause. And then Paul Adair said something that I had never heard from him before. He said it quietly, and he said it with a certainty that settled into the room like something solid and old. He said, not long now. He closed the line. I set my pad down. I looked out at the orbital ring. I thought about 31% of Earth's food supply. I thought about 12,000 settlers on 3 reclassified moons. I thought about 11,000 filed opinions in an archive that no one read. I thought about my grandmother saying, you learn everything, you give away nothing. And somewhere far beneath me, beneath the crust of Vethsora Prime, beneath the stone and the mineral water smell and the clean hum of alien ventilation systems, something in me shifted. It was not anger anymore. Anger was hot and it burned and it wore you out. This was something different. Something colder. Something that settled into the bones and waited very quietly for its moment. I went to bed. For the first time in months, I slept well. I did not know yet why Paul had said not long. I did not know what he knew that I did not. I did not know about the Arecibo Strategic Complex, or Project Pale Blue, or the 17 militaries, or any of it. But I knew Paul Adair. And I knew that when a man like that said not long with that particular tone of voice, he was not guessing. Something was coming. And the council, in its gold and green and polished confidence, had no idea. They recalled me on a Wednesday. No ceremony. No explanation in the official message beyond the words, immediate consultation required, which in diplomatic language could mean anything from a pleasant briefing to a full crisis. But the channel it came through was the encrypted one. The old routing protocol. That told me it was not a pleasant briefing. I packed in 20 minutes. I said goodbye to Res, who handed me a small data chip as I left. I looked at her, surprised. She said it was the annual compilation of all observer filings, printed to archive specification. She said she thought I might want a copy for my records. Her flat gray face was unreadable, but her 4 hands were very still, and I had learned that very still hands in a Dalhuri meant something that translated roughly as, I see more than my job requires me to say. I thanked her. I took the chip. I walked out of the council building and did not look back. The transit home took 11 days. I spent most of it at the narrow window in my cabin, watching the stars move and thinking about Paul's words. Not long now. What did that mean? I had been with Earth's diplomatic corps for over a decade. I knew how our government moved, in careful steps, with committees and reviews and 3 rounds of internal approval before anything significant was decided. We did not move fast. We were not a fast-moving people when it came to large decisions. Or so I had believed. The ship docked at the Nairobi orbital platform on a clear morning. The Earth below was a deep, living blue-green, the kind of color that you forget about when you are living under alien lights for too long, and that hits you like something physical when you see it again. I pressed my hand against the cold viewport glass and just looked at it for a moment. There was a car waiting for me. Not a government standard vehicle. A black car with tinted windows and a driver who did not introduce himself and did not answer when I asked where we were going. We drove for 2 hours through the Kenyan highlands, north and west, into terrain I did not recognize. The roads narrowed. The trees thickened. And then we came to a gate in a hillside that looked, from the outside, like the entrance to a water management facility. It was not a water management facility. Inside, the mountain opened up. I had grown up knowing about the Arecibo Strategic Complex only by name, and even then only because of a single mention in a history module I had taken in secondary school, a footnote about Cold War-era satellite monitoring infrastructure that had been decommissioned and repurposed. What I stepped into was not decommissioned. What I stepped into was the most active, most alive, most deliberately enormous piece of organized human effort I had ever seen in my life. The main chamber was the size of a small city. Not an exaggeration. 3 levels of suspended walkways crossed above a floor that was covered in workstations, screens, and equipment I could not immediately identify. The ceiling was natural rock, but shot through with embedded lighting that gave it the appearance of a dark sky full of stars. And everywhere, there were people. Hundreds of them. Moving with the focused, unhurried efficiency of people who had been at this for a very long time and had no need to rush. Paul Adair was waiting for me on the 2nd level. He was shorter than his video image suggested, and he had aged in the years since I last saw him in person, the kind of aging that came not from time but from work. He shook my hand and then held it for a moment longer than a handshake required. "How are you?" he asked. "Confused," I said honestly. He almost smiled. "Good. That means we hit it well." He walked me through it over the next 3 hours. Not all of it. I understood later that what he showed me that day was the portion I needed to understand in order to do my next job. The full picture was larger than any one person was shown in a single session. But what I saw was enough. Earth had never stopped building. That was the sentence that kept repeating in my head as Paul walked me from station to station, as he introduced me to engineers and logistics commanders and intelligence analysts and a retired admiral named Constance Farrow who had the calm eyes of someone who had spent decades solving very hard problems and expected to spend several more decades doing the same. Earth had never stopped building. While we filed our 11,000 opinions. While I smiled at Threlvon. While we maintained our cooperative neutrality and attended our sessions from behind our frosted partition. While we were quiet and careful and patient in every public space where the council could see us, we had been building. 17 national militaries had been quietly, over the course of 40 years, brought under a single command structure. Not announced. Not registered with the council, because nothing in our probationary agreement required us to register internal defense organization changes. The structure was documented as emergency coordination frameworks. Natural disaster response networks. Planetary defense research groups. All technically accurate. All deeply incomplete as descriptions. Project Pale Blue was a logistics network. Paul showed me the map on a screen that filled an entire wall. It was a web of supply routes, fuel depots, communication relays, and transit corridors that stretched across 6 star systems, every single one of them built along pathways that did not intersect with a single council-controlled relay point. Every component sourced from human-controlled or allied suppliers. Every route stress-tested for sustained operation under blockade conditions. Blockade conditions. They had built it to function under exactly the conditions the Keth Accord had just created. I stood in front of that map for a long time. How long? I asked. The planning began 42 years ago, Paul said. After the second reclassification attempt. The one before the moons. I turned to look at him. I was 11 years old. Yes. They were already planning this when I was 11 years old. Someone was. He said it with a kind of quiet respect, the way you spoke about people who had started something they knew they would not live to finish. Different teams. Different generations. The knowledge passed down inside the complex. Some of what you're looking at was designed by people who have since retired. Or died. People who did this work knowing the payoff would come decades after them. I did not say anything for a moment. I was thinking about the frosted partition. About the archive. About 11,000 filed opinions and the small green confirmation and rest telling me gently that no active delegate was required to read them. You used me, I said. Not with anger. Carefully. Like someone testing a word to see if it fit. Paul was quiet. I don't mean it as an accusation, I said. I just want to understand. You were not deceived about your role, he said. You were the delegate. You did the work that needed doing. You kept us in the room. You kept the lines open. You built a record that documented every violation, every ignored filing, every unread objection over a decade. That record matters. He paused. But yes. You were also the delay. While they were watching you file opinions, they were not watching the complex. While they were watching us maintain our cooperative neutrality, they were not watching what was being built beneath it. Dr. Osei, you were never just an observer. I repeated those words to myself. I let them settle. I thought about what it meant that my government had sent a young woman to sit behind a frosted partition for 10 years, knowing what was being built at home, knowing what her patience was buying. I thought about how I might have felt if I had known. If I had walked into that chamber on day one understanding the full picture. Would I have been able to maintain a decade of quiet smiling? Would the anger have burned through the performance before the work was done? Maybe not. Maybe the woman who sat behind that partition not knowing was more useful than the woman who would have sat there knowing. What happens now? I asked. Constance Farrow answered. She had come up behind us quietly, the way she seemed to move through all spaces, as if she had learned long ago to take up only the space that was necessary. Now, she said, Earth speaks. She handed me a single data chip. Your new credentials, she said. And your new instructions. I looked at the chip in my hand. It was the same size as the archive chip Res had pressed into my palm 11 days ago. 2 chips. 60 years of silence between them. When? I asked. Farrow looked at Paul. Paul looked at the map on the wall. The council has called an emergency session, he said. In response to the Keith Accord protests from the Dalhousie outer blocks. They scheduled it for 8 days from now. He turned to look at me. We'll be ready in 6. I looked at the map. The web of routes and relays and supply lines stretching across 6 star systems. The thing that had been built beneath 6 decades of quiet smiling. The thing that no one on the council had thought to look for, because they had never imagined that the species behind the frosted partition was anything more than what it appeared to be. What am I walking in there to do? I said. Paul Adair looked at me with the steady eyes of a man who had spent his career preparing for this moment and knew exactly what came next. You're walking in there to end the waiting, he said. Farrow was already walking back toward her station. Over her shoulder, she said, Get some sleep, Dr. Osei. You have 6 days. And the council has no idea. I held the chip. I looked at the map. I felt, for the first time in 10 years, something that was not patience and was not anger and was not the careful, practiced calm of a diplomat behind a frosted partition. I felt ready. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened at 0900 local time on a morning when the sky above Vethsora Prime was a deep, clear amber, the kind of dawn that the planet produced twice each year when its twin moons were in alignment and scattered the light in long, horizontal bands across the atmosphere. It was beautiful. I noticed it because I had trained myself, over 10 years, to notice beautiful things in alien places. It helped keep the mind clear. I had arrived on Vethsora Prime 2 days earlier. Officially, I was there to re-establish my observer posting following my personal consultation leave, which was how Paul's office had described my recall. I had re-registered with the council's administrative office. I had collected my blue tag. I had smiled at the registration clerk and thanked her for the efficiency of the process. But I had also done 3 other things. The first was that I had met, quietly and separately, with 4 members of the Dalhousie delegation. The outer block delegates who had voted against the Keith Accord. I had not made promises. I had not offered anything concrete. I had simply asked them questions and listened to their answers, and at the end of 2 hours across 3 separate conversations, I understood that the Dalhousie opposition to the accord was not simply economic. It was structural. They did not like what the council was becoming. They had seen this pattern before in their own history, the slow drift of a cooperative body toward something that served fewer and fewer members while maintaining the language of service to all. They had not acted on that concern yet. They were waiting for a reason. The second thing I did was walk through every room of the council building that I was permitted to enter. I walked slowly, as I always had, with my data pad open and my expression calm. I looked at the chamber from angles I had never examined. I looked at the partition. I looked at the exact distance from the partition to the central dais. I walked it 3 times. I counted the steps. 14 steps. The third thing I did was call Constance Farrow to confirm that everything was in position. She said 2 words, "We're ready." I slept 8 hours that night. When I woke, I put on my standard delegate attire, dark gray, professional, the Earth Diplomatic Corps insignia on the collar. The same thing I had worn behind the partition every day for 10 years. Then I put the new credentials chip in my left breast pocket, over my heart. And I went to the chamber. The session was called to address the Dalhousie protests regarding the Kth Accord. Ambassador Threlvan opened it with his usual composed efficiency. The chamber was full. Every major delegation was present. This was a significant session, the kind where the council's direction might shift, or might be reinforced, and everyone wanted to be in the room when it happened. I took my seat behind the partition. I set my data pad on the small table in front of me. I was very calm. The session began with formal remarks. 3 speakers. The usual procedural texture of a council session, each movement carefully placed, each silence intentional. I had watched hundreds of these. I knew the rhythms. I knew when the chamber was alert and when it was beginning to drift toward the comfortable assumption that the session would resolve predictably. I waited for that moment. The moment when confidence became complacency. It came during the 4th speaker's remarks, a Vedhani junior delegate delivering a statistical summary of biosynthesizer trade flow projections. The chamber was listening, but not sharply. Not on the edge of attention. I stood up. There was a procedural rule I had found, 3 years into my posting, buried in the subarticles of the Observer Engagement Framework. It stated that an observer delegate could, in the event of a direct and material threat to the welfare of the observer's home world, request a point of recognition to submit updated credentials for council review. Not a vote. Not a speech. A request. Which, technically, required the presiding officer to acknowledge. No observer had ever used it. Partly because most observers were from worlds that were close enough to membership that they would not risk the political cost. Partly because the rule was so obscure that most observer delegates did not know it existed. I had found it on a Tuesday afternoon 18 months into my posting, while reading through administrative subarticles because I had nothing else to do, and I had quietly flagged it in my private archive and never mentioned it to anyone except, eventually, Paul Adair. I stood up. The junior delegate stopped speaking. Threlvan's head turned toward the partition. Several hundred other heads followed. The chamber shifted from the comfortable half-attention of a statistics summary to something much sharper. I held up my data pad with the request formatted and transmitted to the official record before I had even risen fully to my feet. Procedurally locked in. Requiring acknowledgement. Threlvan's skin flickered. Gold, then a stripe of something darker, a deep copper that I had not seen in him before. He did not have a graceful option. He acknowledged. Observer Osei, he said, and his voice was smooth and even, but the copper deepened. The Council recognizes your procedural request under Subarticle 14 of the Observer Engagement Framework. You may approach the administrative desk to submit your updated credentials. The administrative desk was at the edge of the chamber floor. On the other side of the partition. I picked up my data pad. I walked to the partition and I pushed it open. It swung easily. It had never been locked. I had never tried. I walked through it. 14 steps to the central dais. I counted them. I had counted them 3 times 2 days ago and I counted them again now, steadily, with the chamber entirely silent around me, every set of eyes tracking the woman in gray walking across the open floor of the Galactic Council chamber to the central dais where no human being had ever stood. I set my credentials chip on the surface of the dais. I connected it to the data port. I let it speak for itself for a moment, because what it contained was more eloquent than anything I could say. The credentials it carried were not observer credentials. They carried Earth's formal application for full membership in the Galactic Council, along with full voting rights, a permanent seat, and retroactive legal recognition of all 60 years of probationary period violations under the terms of the original agreement. They carried the complete documentation of every ignored filing, every unread objection, every unacknowledged communique. They carried the full legal argument, constructed over 42 years by successive generations of Earth's international legal teams, for why the Keth Accord was illegal under 5 separate articles of the original charter. And they carried one more thing. Admiral Constance Farrow's voice came through the chamber's public diplomatic band at that exact moment, calm and clear and carrying the particular quality of someone who was very comfortable with the weight of what she was saying. She identified herself. She identified her current position. Then she described the current position of 900 Earth vessels arranged in a complete ring around Vethsora Prime's orbital approach corridors. Not inside the atmosphere. Not threatening the planet. Simply present. Simply there. Simply making a fact out of something that the Council had not believed was possible. No weapons were active. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to the kind of story this is. The ships were not there to threaten. They were there to be seen. There is a difference, and it is not a small one. A threat is what you make when you are afraid. A presence is what you establish when you are certain. Earth was certain. The chamber stayed silent for a long time after Farrow's voice finished. I looked at Threlvon. His skin had gone to a color I had never seen in him. Not gold. Not copper. Something between white and silver, which in Vethani physiology, I knew from my study of their biology, was the color of a calculation being revised. He was revising his calculation. I waited. I was very good at waiting. Observer Osei, he said finally, and his voice was still controlled, but the control was working harder than usual. The Council will require time to review these materials. Of course, I said. Earth is patient. We have always been patient. I paused, and I let the pause be exactly as long as it needed to be. We are simply done being quiet. He looked at the credentials on the dais. He looked at me. He looked toward the screen where Farrow's transmission had originated. Then he said, "The Council will recess for consultation." I nodded. I did not say anything else. I did not need to. The credentials were on the dais. The ships were in the orbital corridor. The record was complete. Every filed opinion, every unread communique, every small green confirmation from the archive system, all of it time-stamped and documented and formatted into a legal argument that had been built over 42 years by people who had never expected to live to see it delivered. I had delivered it. I stepped back from the dais. I did not go back to the partition. I stood in the open chamber, on the floor where I had no technical right to stand, and I waited. No one asked me to move. The recess lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. I sat in a chair in the antechamber with a cup of water and my data pad and the stillness that had been trained into me over a decade of sitting behind frosted glass and not flinching at things that deserved to be flinched at. Ress found me there an hour in. She sat down across from me without being invited, which was unusual for her. She looked at me for a moment with her flat gray face and her very still hands. "You knew," I said. "I knew something was different about this delegation," she said. "I did not know the specifics." A pause. "I am glad the archive chip will not be necessary for much longer." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" She folded her hands. "It means," she said carefully, "that the Dalhuri outer block has been waiting for a reason to call for a structural review of Council membership procedures for many years. And a reason has arrived." She paused. "I filed a personal notation to the administrative record this morning, noting that Observer Osei had never, in 10 years, failed to follow every procedural rule available to her position." Her voice was perfectly even. "I thought the record should reflect that." I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you, Ress." She nodded and stood up and went back to work. When the recess ended and I walked back into the chamber, the atmosphere had changed in the particular way that atmospheres change when the people in a room have understood that the balance of a situation has shifted and are now deciding how to respond to the new reality rather than the old one. Threlvan was still at the head of the table. But the copper was gone from his skin. He was back to gold, which meant he had reached a decision. He asked me to approach the table. I walked the 14 steps again. He said that the council was prepared to enter into binding arbitration on the contested points of the Kth Accord. He said that Earth's membership application would be advanced to primary review status, the first stage of full consideration. He said that the 3 reclassified moons would be placed under administrative hold pending resolution of the membership question. It was not everything. Not yet. Binding arbitration was not a yes. Administrative hold was not a reversal. Primary review was not a seat. But it was the opening of a door that had been sealed for 60 years. I looked at him. He was waiting for my response with the practiced patience of a very good political mind that had learned how to lose a round and position it as a development. I said, Earth accepts, with the condition that the administrative hold on the moons includes immediate recognition of the existing settler communities as protected residents pending full resolution. He considered this for 3 seconds. Then he said, accepted. I nodded. Then Earth accepts the framework. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he asked me a question. Quietly, not for the chamber. Meant to delegate, or as close as 2 very different beings could come to that. How, he said. I knew what he was asking. How did we hide so much for so long? How did we build 900 ships and a 6-system logistics network and a 42-year legal argument without a single council monitoring system detecting it? How did we smile and file our opinions and maintain our cooperative neutrality while all of that was being constructed beneath the surface? I thought about my grandmother. About keeping your eyes open and your mouth careful. About what you carry in here, which no one can take. You never asked, I said. His skin rippled. Not gold. Not copper. Something that, if it had a human translation, might have been very close to respect. He called the session back to order. And for the first time in 60 years, when the record listed the parties present in the chamber, it did not say Observer Delegate Ose of Earth. It said Delegate Ose of Earth. One word. The difference between those 2 words was 60 years and 11,000 filed opinions and 3 moons and 31% of a food supply and the patience of a species that had been learning everything and giving away nothing. One word. I sat down at the table. Not behind the partition. At the table. The mineral surface was cold under my hands. I opened my datapad. And for the first time in 10 years, I began to type not a filing, not an objection, not an opinion for an archive that no one read. I typed a message to Paul Adair. It said, "We're in the room." His reply came in 30 seconds. It said, "Welcome home." The binding arbitration lasted 4 months. I want to tell you that it was dramatic, that it moved in swift and decisive moments, that the outcome was never in doubt and everyone could feel the momentum. The truth is that it was mostly very long meetings in medium-sized rooms with 17 different legal teams arguing over the precise meaning of words that had been written by people who were long dead. There was nothing glamorous about it. There were days when I sat across the table from Bethani legal specialists and argued for 6 hours about the definition of the word resident as applied to a human settlement on a moon that had been unilaterally reclassified as uninhabited. But the outcome was real. That part, I want to be precise about. The Kth Accord was dissolved in its entirety. Not modified. Not amended. Dissolved. The Council issued a formal declaration that the Accord had been applied outside the legal scope defined by the original Charter, and that its terms were therefore unenforceable. Biosynthesizer components began moving toward Earth through regular trade channels within 11 days of the dissolution. The 3 moons, Kepler-62's outer ring settlements, were formally recognized as inhabited communities with protected resident status. The 12,000 people who had been called uninhabited by the Council's reclassification vote received official documentation of their standing. I learned later that there was a small celebration in the settlement on the 2nd moon, a gathering in the main hydroponic hall where people ate a meal together and played music. I was not there for it. But someone sent me a recording. I watched it in my quarters on Vethsora Prime, alone, in the middle of the arbitration process when everything was still uncertain and exhausting, and I watched these 12,000 people eat and talk and laugh in a room full of growing things under artificial light, and I did not maintain my professional composure. I cried. I cried for a while. Then I washed my face and went back to work. Earth's membership application moved through primary review in 6 weeks, which the Council's administrative office noted was the fastest progress in the review system's history. Secondary review took another 8 weeks. The final vote on full membership was scheduled for a Thursday, because of course it was. The universe has a particular fondness for ordinary days when it decides to do extraordinary things. I was there for the vote. I sat at the table. The vote was not unanimous. The Council was never unanimous about anything, and I had spent enough time in the chamber to understand that unanimity was not the goal and never had been. The goal was majority. And we got it, with 11 votes over the required threshold. When the presiding officer announced the result, the chamber produced the particular sound that large rooms full of many different species produce when something significant has happened, a layered, overlapping collection of sounds, none of them quite what a human would call applause, but all of them expressing the same general function. Acknowledgement. Response. The recognition that a thing had changed. I sat very still. My hands were flat on the table. I kept my face professionally composed because I was at the table now and the table required that. But underneath the table, where no one could see, I pressed my palm against the cold mineral surface and I held it there, feeling the temperature of 60 years of waiting in a piece of stone that had been cooling in the void for 1 billion years before anyone found it. After the session, I walked back through the building to the antechamber where I had spent a decade of my professional life behind a frosted partition. The partition was still there. It had not been physically removed. I stood in front of it for a moment. It was just glass. Frosted glass in an aluminum frame. On the other side of it was a small table and a chair and a socket for a data pad. The chair had a slight scuff on the left rear leg that I knew because I had looked at it from behind for so long that I had memorized every detail. The scuff was from the 3rd week of my posting, when I had pushed the chair back quickly and it had caught the baseboard. I remembered the moment exactly. A vote on resource extraction rights that had nothing to do with Earth, and I had pushed back from the table too fast and scratched the leg and spent the rest of the afternoon looking at the scratch. I reached out and touched the frosted glass. Then I let my hand drop and I walked back out into the hall. Paul Adair called me that evening. A proper call, not through the encrypted channel. Through the main diplomatic line, official and open, the way you called when there was nothing left to hide. Congratulations, he said. Not just me, I said. No, he agreed. Not just you. Not even mostly you. But you were the face of it. I was the delay, I said. I was not being bitter. I had worked through the feeling of that word over 4 months of arbitration, in the spaces between legal sessions, and I had reached a place where I could say it plainly without it stinging. I had been the delay. That was not a lesser role. It was just a different kind of courage than the one I had thought I was practicing at the time. Paul was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were both. You were the delay and you were the one who walked through the partition. Same person. Same decade of work." I thought about that. How is Earth taking it? I asked. Billions of people, he said, who didn't know what their silence was buying. Finding out all at once. He paused. It's a lot for people to process. Some are angry that they weren't told. Some understand why they couldn't be. Most are just. He stopped. Searched for the word. Relieved. Relieved. Yes. I understood that. Someone asked me once, during the public interviews that followed in the weeks after the vote, whether I felt proud. It was a journalist from Lagos, a young man with very bright eyes and a notepad he kept turning over in his hands as if he was not quite used to using one. He asked me if I felt proud of what Earth had accomplished. I thought about the word. Pride is a thing you feel when you have done something you chose to do. A lot of what happened in those 60 years was not chosen by the people who lived through it. The sanctions. The reclassifications. The decade of sitting behind glass and filing into an archive that no one read. 12,000 people called uninhabited. The families who went to bed not knowing that a quarter of the food supply was under threat. They did not choose that. They endured it. That was not the same as pride. I feel relieved, I told him. Pride will come later. He wrote it down. He asked when later would be. When the children who were born during the sanctions, I said, can eat food that was not rationed. When the settlers on the moons have documentation that can never be overwritten. When a young delegate from any world sits at the council table and the record shows that when someone drew a line, we drew one back. When that matters to someone who hasn't been born yet. I looked at him. Pride is slow. It needs time to know what it is proud of. He published the interview 3 days later. I read it on my data pad on a transport headed back to Earth for the first time in a year and a half. The amber sky of Vethsora Prime was behind me. The blue-green of Earth was ahead. I want to tell you about the last thing I did before I left the council building on my final official day of what I would now call my first posting rather than my only posting, because Earth would be sending delegates there for a very long time and I intended to be one of them. I went to the administrative office. I found the archive. The secondary archive where all observer filings were automatically routed, the ones that no active delegate was required to read. I asked the clerk, a young Vethani male with a carefully neutral expression, whether the archive was still operational. He said it was. I asked him to print me a copy of the full archive index. All 11,244 filings submitted by Earth's observer delegation over 60 years. He looked at me for a moment. Then he printed it. It came out on a long, folded document, pages and pages of filing dates and reference numbers and subject lines. I held it in my hands. It weighed almost nothing. I folded it carefully and put it in my bag. I was not keeping it as a monument to grievance. I was keeping it as a map. A map of everything that had been said when no one was listening, everything that had been documented when no one was watching, everything that had been filed carefully and correctly and completely into a system that was designed to make it disappear. It had not disappeared. None of it had disappeared. It was all still there, and in the end, it was part of what had mattered. Paul had said it on the night the accord passed, when this is over, the record needs to show that we gave them every chance. We had given them every chance. The archive was the proof. Back in my quarters that last evening, I opened the private file I had kept since my grandmother died, where I stored things I wanted to remember. I had very few entries. A photograph of Adwoa, taken when she was young and standing in front of a building that was later demolished, her expression somewhere between serious and trying not to laugh. A recording of her voice from a family gathering, reading a poem she had memorized as a child. A set of notes from a conversation we had 2 weeks before she passed, where she told me everything she had carried in here that she had never given away. I added a new entry. Just a few lines. I wrote, 10 years behind a partition. 4 months of arbitration. 1 vote. 60 years of patience that was never only patience. 11,000 opinions filed to an archive. 3 moons returned. 1 seat at 1 table. I walked 14 steps across an open floor and I set a chip on a stone surface and I waited and nothing broke. Then I wrote the last line. She was right about what you carry. No one took it. No one ever could. I closed the file. I packed my bag. I looked out the window of my quarters at the orbital ring above Vethsora Prime for the last time that posting, its light steady and bright against the dark. In 6 months I would be back. Not as an observer. Not as a delay. As a delegate, with a seat and a vote and a data pad full of things I intended to say out loud to a room that was required, finally, to respond. But that was 6 months from now. Tonight, the sky above Vethsora Prime was amber, and I was going home, and the earth below was the color of something living. I thought about my grandmother walking between villages in a drought because she had no other choice, and I thought about the 11,000 filed opinions, and I thought about 12,000 settlers on 3 moons who now had documentation, and I thought about Paul Adair saying not long now in the voice he used when he was certain. And I thought about what I had written for the archive, on that last day, the note that would sit at the top of every file submitted by Earth's first full delegate to the Galactic Council. It said, "We were silent because we chose to be. And when we chose to speak, the universe listened." Remember both. The silence mattered as much as the words. I have spent a lot of time in the years since then thinking about whether that is true. Whether the silence mattered, or whether it was simply the only option we had, dressed up in retrospect as strategy. I think both things can be true. I think you can have no choice and still make something of the choice you have no choice about. I think patience forced on you can still become patience practiced, if you are deliberate about it, if you keep your eyes open and your mouth careful and you learn everything and you give away nothing. I think my grandmother knew this. I think the people who started building the complex 42 years before I ever walked through that gate in the hillside knew this. I think the delegates who came before me, who sat behind the same partition and filed their opinions into the same archive, knew this in whatever way they were able to know it. We did not conquer the council. We did not threaten it into submission or outmaneuver it in some flash of brilliant strategy. We simply waited until we were ready. We kept the record clean. We followed every rule they gave us and found every rule they forgot to block. We built what we needed in the spaces they were not watching because they had decided we were not worth watching. And then, when the moment came, we walked through a door that had never been locked and we set a chip on a table and we let 60 years of careful work do the speaking. It was not a glorious story. Not in the way stories are usually called glorious. No single great battle. No moment of individual heroism that you could point to and say, there, that was the turning point. The turning point was 11,000 filed opinions. The turning point was a single procedural subarticle buried in an administrative framework that no observer had ever needed to read. The turning point was a Dalhousie administrative clerk pressing a data chip into the hand of a departing delegate and saying she thought she might want it for her records. The turning point was 42 years of people who would never see the outcome building something that would outlast them, passing the knowledge down like a map through a territory they would never personally cross. The turning point was a grandmother telling a child, you learn everything, you give away nothing. It did not look like a turning point while it was happening. It looked like patience. It looked like waiting. It looked like a woman in gray sitting behind frosted glass and typing into a data pad and filing into an archive. But it was the whole thing. All of it. Every quiet moment of it. And when the universe finally listened, it was because we had spent 60 years making sure we had something worth saying. I am 51 years old now. I have been Earth's delegate to the Galactic Council for 6 years. I sit at the table. I vote. I propose. I call points of order when the process drifts. I file opinions into the main record, the one that every active delegate is required to engage with, and they are engaged with. There is still a frosted partition in the antechamber. I did not ask them to remove it. I thought about asking. I decided against it. It is a reminder. Not for me. For the room. It is a reminder that the things you build to contain people sometimes tell you more about the builders than the people inside them. It is a reminder that silence is not the same as agreement, and patience is not the same as surrender, and the fact that someone is not speaking does not mean they have nothing to say. It is a reminder that the person behind the glass is always, always watching. And somewhere, in the spaces you are not watching, they are building.